Good morning and welcome to this public briefing of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Kieran Testart. I am the MLA for Range Lake and the acting chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room to introduce themselves for the record. We'll start with Mr. McNeely.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Danny McNeely and I represent the Sahtu region.
Good morning. I'm Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Good morning. I'm Cheryl Yakla. I'm a member for the Techo.
Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on housing as a human right from Jenni Bruce with Midwest Property Management. This briefing is part of the committee's study on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. Please note that our meeting today is being live streamed, the Assembly's social media channels. I will remind all members and witnesses to direct questions and comments to myself as chair and wait to be recognized before speaking. And now I'll pass things over to our presenter, Ms. Bruce. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your presentation.
Hi, I'm Jenni Bruce. I'm the regional manager for the Yellowknife region for Midwest Properties. We have 11 buildings with, I believe, 538 units, and we are privately owned. All right, thank you for letting me present to you today. Midwest has operated in Yellowknife for over 50 years, and we consider ourselves part of the community. I've personally been with Midwest for over 10 years, and I've called Yellowknife my home for over 27 years. In that time, I've seen a dramatic shift in the challenges that face us in our day-to-day operation. We contribute over $200,000 a year to local charities through sponsorships, and we spend an average of $225,000 a year on repairs from vandalism and cleaning of public areas. More than half of this is due to damage and bodily fluids from intruders. We also write off roughly $150,000 a year in bad debt due to residents not paying rent and an inability to collect it from them. This summer, we had over $80,000 in cameras damaged and doors kicked in a matter of weeks. Camera footage revealed that it was people living in the encampment. We also had issues with feces beside parked cars, extension cords being plugged into car plug-ins, and garbage both on the ground of our property as well as overflowing from our dumpsters. Our residents also witnessed extreme violence to women in the encampment on a daily basis, as well as very public drug deals. Our residents have an expectation of security, and during this time, they did not feel safe to leave their home. Currently, there's too many barriers to building in the north and even more costs. Without more housing, rents will continue to rise. To create affordable housing, it needs to be a business model that works for the private sector as well as the public sector. Otherwise, we would not be willing to come to the table. The rental office has become a cumbersome process and not the optimal route for eviction. Midwest Property has historically only filed for eviction when we've exhausted all other avenues. We have worked with residents on payment plans and helped them to secure funding. If there is a discussion about eviction for non-payment of rent being harder for a landlord to get, who should shoulder that expense? Currently, it's leaning towards putting it on the private sector, and this will just create higher rent increases and make it harder to rent an apartment in the NWT. As I present to you today, we have two separate residents who owe more than $25,000 each in rent, and we've not been successful in evicting them. We even have an eviction ruling from the rental officer. The legal bills alone to get an eviction are close to $10,000 at this point. Should a private operator be expected to shoulder this expense? Private housing operates under different legislation and guidelines than public housing, and all too often is brought into conversations that are relevant only to public housing challenges. We feel that housing is a human right. However, I encourage you to look at what cost this right comes to and who should bear this cost. In closing, I'd like to express that we would like to see all of the NWT population housed. We just wonder how to balance this with protecting them at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce. Committee will now turn to questions and answers. Does anyone have anything? Yes, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Bruce, for coming today. And it was a clear and simple message and information, so we really appreciate that. You had mentioned that you find the rental office pretty cumbersome, and that you've tried to seek eviction for tenants who are owing more than $25,000 in rent, but you were not successful in seeking eviction. Can you explain a bit more about what makes the rental office cumbersome and what reasons they give for you not being able to evict tenants, and like what is the other, what other suggested recourse is there from your perspective? Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Ms. Bruce. We'll direct things through me just for the sake of our operator and members of I neglected to say we'll give 5-minute time blocks for everyone. So, Ms. Bruce, you can take over.
All right, thank you, and great question. Overall, it's bureaucracy, so you go through quite a bit of paperwork. You can wait upwards of 4 to 6 weeks to actually get the hearing. Then when you get the hearing, it tends to be hesitant to grant an eviction even when it is something as cut and dried as the rent is not being paid. A great example would be they could be $7,000 in arrears, but they paid $500 last month, so the rental officer would rule a payment plan and give them 6 months to catch it up. And at that time, if they haven't caught it up, you would file again. And then at that time, if they've made a couple payments, they tend to stretch it out. We tend to only be successful when it's somebody that hasn't paid for months and months. The two that I've referred to in here, neither of them have paid rent in over a year. We actually did go to the rental office. We were granted an eviction through the rental office. We delivered that. They chose to appeal in the 14-day window, and that takes it to Supreme Court. I can say the first appeal came through, I believe, in March of last year, and we still haven't had a hearing for that. So they haven't paid rent in upwards of 2 years. They've had a balance, and we're still sitting waiting, and we're eventually going to get that eviction, but it will now have snowballed into a place they can't afford to pay it. But we do tend to try, when I say we go for eviction last, we try and work with the resident, because quite often they've just fell on some hard times, and we can come up with a way to get a payment plan from them.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce. You had mentioned damages to your buildings, but you had talked about it mostly in the context of people staying nearby, like not necessarily residents themselves. Do you also struggle with damages to the building from residents, and are you able to get residents to pay for any damages? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
Thanks. Yes, we do actually struggle with the residents in the units. When they move out, if they've got extreme damage in the unit, we of course have to fix that up and get it ready to rent. And then we just pass those charges on to them minus their security deposit. And again, that comes into the part we write off, because 99% of the time they don't have a way to pay that back. I can speak to, and one individual unit can be anywhere from $20,000 to $30,000 to fix once they've moved out.
Thank you. Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And can you just clarify, if someone is still living there but there are damages, are you as the landlord expected to pay for the repairs and damages? I guess there must be some sort of investigation as to like who caused the damage and how and who pays, but I'm just wondering how that process goes and whether the landlord ends up having to pay for sort of ongoing repairs in the midst of those kinds of disputes. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Bruce.
Under the legislation, there's some pretty good definition on when the resident is responsible and when the landlord is responsible. when it is the resident who's responsible, it is still on the landlord to collect for that. We do still perform the repairs when we can, but at the end of the day, the responsibility falls on us to collect for those damages.
Thank you, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you. That's fine, thanks.
And just, do you pass those costs, like the costs of repairing damages onto, sorry, I should ask first, do you have tenants or leases with the NWT housing or the public housing authorities, Ms. Bruce?
No, we do not currently. We do have residents under income support, and we do work with YWCA and places like that, but we don't have any that are officially rented by Yellowknife Housing.
Okay, thank you for that. Mr. McNeely, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say, from a commerce point of view, I can see the challenges, and I, to some degree, feel for the shareholders, but also considering the fact that it's taken you over 10,000 in collection fees and 20 to 30,000 in repairs. So how are you staying in the business? It's kind of like a thought, but it's understandable considering the environment that Northwest Territories has really went from 20, 30 years ago to today with the influx of addictions and illegal drugs. Are you familiar with the new proposed scan legislation that's going to be presented during this winter session? And how do you feel about that scan legislation? I forget what the acronym stands for. Maybe you can help me out there, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. That's Safer Communities and Neighborhoods legislation. Ms. Bruce.
Thank you. Just a point of clarification, we don't have shareholders. We are owned by two men, and they're actually the original sons of the people that built our buildings. So I am familiar with the scan legislation. I do think it's a great piece of legislation that runs the risk that every piece of legislation does to be abused on either side. So it would just be about being aware of that.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely.
Okay, thank you for that that reply. And Mr. Chair, my next question is: Have you given any thought to the Tenants Act and the current legislation that you're operating within, and how to make suggestions to better improve it, so that businesses like yourself could have some leverage in collecting income to avoid
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. We might have to put extra time on the clock for this answer, but Ms. Bruce, do your best.
I'll try and go long story short. Timing would be crucial. I tend to find all too often someone falls into not being able to pay their rent. We work with them. Usually by the time it gets to the rental officer, with the time of filing, they're upwards of 3 months in arrears. And that becomes an effect they can't dig out of. And it becomes hard to work with that. So I think at the end of the day, timing and maybe something a bit more finite when it's a cut and dried case of there's an obvious showing of rent is not being paid. When we do have that resident that can pay $1,000 and can't pay the rest, that's when we do kick into payment plans and try and work with them. And I'm actually proud to say we have quite a bit of success. We did not evict one resident during all of COVID, and we're able to work with them, and almost all of them have been able to catch up since then. So it's for the ones that don't want to pay.
Mr. McNeely.
my last follow-up, thanks, Mr. Chair, is you never quite answered my question there, Ms. Bruce, and that the fact is your recommendations to maybe writing our committee. What do you think about the current legislation, and what improvements you would suggest to that current legislation? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
To get into specifics, I think I'd want to sit with that legislation and go through it. But overall, the timing of the filing, the power of the rental officer, how to deal with it when it's cut and dried cases. I respect that it needs to be a longer process when it's a behavioral issue, unless it's health and safety, and that's where the scan comes in. So overall, I think it's become a process that doesn't have any enforcement behind it.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely.
Nothing further.
Ms. Yakalaya.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the damages and the repayment plan. So how, in your opinion, can this be fixed? I guess we got to look at some preventative ways and maybe incorporate some things into the legislation where the housing is a human right, so there's protection in place for the renters, not the renters, but the owners of the buildings. You know, so we have something that's concrete that says this is the way it works. And the other question I have is, your people that are not paying rent, are they the private owners or private renters, or are they the income support people? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
I think it's a bit of both. I think only when it's the income support issues is it usually comes down to they get removed from income support and we're not notified. And then suddenly we don't get the checks anymore. That's about the only time that one comes up for us. It tends to be private renters. And I don't know that I have the solution.
Ms. Yakalaya.
There's a lot to it. It's I guess for me it's just to find solutions on how things could be done faster for some protection in place for the people that own the buildings. It's good that you say that, you know, your organization is giving back to the community, helping the community. So, and then you also mentioned that damages were happening because of the encampment that is located close to one of your buildings. You did see some, you said that you had things saw on camera, the damages that happened and violence against people. So I'm kind of trying to find what I think, but it's, for me, it's like finding a solution to fix these things. So what is the solution? How, in your opinion, what can we put in place so it's protecting people such as yourselves working in the field of housing people? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
Thank you very much. That is an excellent question. I feel like if I knew a solution, I probably have it out there already. I understand that it's very challenging to house those people. I think our concern comes in the corporate landlords, and they do always seem to have air quotes with them, tend to be a little vilified when it comes to that portion. However, we view ourselves as private companies, so we do have a premium rent because with that we provide more security. I do feel when it comes to that onus is on us to do. With that comes higher rents. Private community isn't doing a lot of developing is the barriers to development. And it doesn't all fall on the legislation. NIMBYs in the Yellowknife area tend to be well-armed and are able to stop development whenever someone's trying. So we've just given up on doing that.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce. Ms. Yakalaya.
Don't have anything further.
Okay, thank you. I have a question. We've heard from some witnesses, and I guess anecdotally as well, that corporate landlords or private landlords operate a blacklist on like problematic tenants. Can you speak to that? Is there a blacklist, Ms. Bruce?
There is no blacklist. I will say we do go through credit history. We do landlord reference checks. However, I would say we don't do those very often. The most credible blacklist you could get to using is the public documents from rental hearings. Those are a matter of public record, and we do check those when we're renting to somebody.
Thank you. And how, when you're doing those checks, like how would you characterize that? How would you characterize your assessment there? Is this about risk, or is it about, are there any other thinking that goes into that, Ms. Bruce?
The first thing we always check is affordability. Can they afford the rent based on their income? Do they have a good credit history? They're not maxed out on their credit. Do they have gainful employment that will keep them able to afford it? We then start looking into past rental history that is available publicly. I assure you there is no private conversations that way. And overall a fit for the building.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned development. What would it take for, or sorry, is Midwest in, do you have the resources to develop new properties in your real estate portfolios, Ms. Bruce?
Yes, we do. I can actually speak to, we were attempting to develop 3 or 4 years ago. Our goal was to get anywhere from 100 doors to 300 doors in Yellowknife. Our owner is very hesitant. We have a lot at Bartesco Court. And all you have to do is Google that, and our owner is very hesitant because he does not want to be seen as a bad person in the community, and that neighborhood is not welcoming to an apartment building. We've seen that happen with other builds in Niven. And then there was discussion and a motion in the ledge regarding rent caps, and they immediately closed the book and said, we're just not going to look to develop in that climate.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce. So Bartesco Court is right down the street from me, so I appreciate how close it is to homes and backyards. But that being said, we do need to look at all of our options and how we can develop, and land tenure and land management is of interest to the committee. We've heard a lot about it. Let's talk about rent caps. So what, I'm not as familiar with that motion as perhaps you are, but we've had a number of things proposed. There's like the more flat-out rent control like you see in Ontario, which is, many private landlords will say has been a failure. You have the creating a ceiling for what you can actually increase. That's common in many other provinces. I think there's more mixed success. So what about that motion was alarming to your management, Ms. Bruce?
I would say it was the vilifying of the corporate landlord. It was that we're not allowed to make money. It's almost the feeling, and we do like to operate at a profit. That's not hidden. We're not a charity. However, if government's going to come in and control how much we can charge, it limits how much we can offer. The security, the repairs, everything comes at an expense. And if we're told you can only rent for this amount, we don't think we'd be able to operate.
So we've heard from a smaller developer in this space that they also think rent caps would be prohibited on their ability to move to do their work and to develop in the community, and kind of at odds with the larger landlords like yourself and the REITs. So it seems like this is a common position across the board. Is there any degree of rent control that industry is comfortable with, like, or sorry, rent caps, rent limits? Because currently it's an annual increase, but it could be any amount. Is there any limitation that you'd be comfortable with that would not adversely impact your willingness to develop in the market, Ms. Bruce?
I think that would have to get pretty individual on the circumstances. I think overall the best solution to rent not going up is creating competition. The more options there are to rent, rent is usually driven a bit by cost and a bit by market. Currently there is a housing crisis and no one has anywhere to move. And that can create risk. Midwest doesn't participate in any, I know we weren't part of the $1,000 rent increases. We try to keep it at a minimum because we are not wanting to be the villain in the story. But I think opening the market and making development more appealing and creating competition is always what's going to drive price down.
Thank you. And you mentioned eviction as a last resort. This is a principle of housing as a human right, as the committee has understood it from the evidence that's been presented to us. Is that a policy of Midwest, or is that kind of your personal view on how to handle evictions, Ms. Bruce?
I wouldn't say that's a specific policy, but we do have an underlying mission, and it's always do the right thing, and that comes from our owner right down. So that is where we factor that in, is let's do the right thing. Let's remember these are people. Have a conversation with them first, and don't just make a decision based on a ledger.
And that's much appreciated. Do no evil. I think that was Google's until they got rid of it. Committee, do you want to ask any more questions, Ms. Morgan?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you just clarify, Ms. Bruce? So you said you don't... Okay. Okay. Like you don't have any housing NWT leases or clients. You do have some clients on income support, and that you work with the YWCA. Do you have any clients that are tenants that are with the Housing First program? Or can you explain what your arrangements are with the YWCA?
Ms. Bruce?
I don't believe we have any with Housing First. I don't know that we've been approached for them. YWCA, historically, they will actually rent the apartment from us with the intention to eventually hand it off to that resident to take over the lease. And we've actually seen great success with that program. We've got a number of residents that now they're on their own lease and they pay their own way. Whether that be through some sort of supplement, we don't know. They pay us. And we have seen great success with that. What we haven't seen great success with is the income support side, where they rent the unit, income support verifies they're going to pay for it, and as I explained earlier, suddenly don't pay for it, and we aren't notified of that till 3 months of not receiving rent.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so that's great to know, to put in context there. And are you able to share with us what your vacancy rates are in your buildings currently, and how vacancy rates may have changed over the last 5 or 10 years? I'm not sure if that's sort of publicly available information or not. Thank you.
I believe it is publicly available through CMHC rates. I can't remember the number offhand, but I can speak to 2024. Midwest was at 1.89% vacancy, which I believe is a historic low for us. That accounts for a few days of an apartment being vacant while we renovate it. That's really what is there. I could speak to this month with 538 apartments. We have 1 notice.
Thank you. Ms. Morgan?
Okay, thank you for that. That's helpful to have that context. I also wondered, so you'd mentioned you pay for security and that your buildings, or that's part of the premium that service that you might offer compared to some other landlords in town. My understanding is that we don't have any regulations or per se in the Northwest Territories around private security firms. And I wonder if you can share how, I'm assuming that you would contract out security services to a private security firm, unless you do that in-house. I'm not sure, but I wonder if you can comment on how you do your sort of private security, and whether you've had any challenges dealing with private security firms in a market that's sort of unregulated, or there's no real oversight to ensure sort of quality control of private security firms. Thank you.
Excellent question. I can say we actually don't work with a security firm. Instead, what we've done is we've got what we call caretakers in our buildings that observe and report. and help us with backup when we do need to involve the RCMP. And with that, they get a rental discount. We tend to find with the lack of legislation, security comes at a bit of a cost with no real ability to do anything other than observe and report. There is a security contractor in town that can do a little bit more. However, they're quite expensive, and just out of our price range, we'd have to do another rent increase, which we're trying to avoid. We are currently in the process of equipping cameras that are going to have speakers and motion alerts, and we will have a company that actually monitors that can speak that way. We're thinking we'll get a bit more bang for our buck that way.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce, for explaining that. Can you explain a bit more about how this role of caretaker works? It's tenants that sort of offer or step up or sort of to take on this role and then they're paid for it? Or who, can you explain who acts as the caretaker and how those arrangements get made? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
Thank you, and it tends to be a bit of an individual situation depending on the building. We have some buildings that have 12 apartments, and we have one that has 100 apartments. So the responsibility varies by building, but more or less we tend to look for a long-term resident that has asked to do it. We usually post a sign and they come see us. It involves everything from checking for damage in hallways and letting us know to reporting when there's been some sort of violence or upset in the building, and it allows us to do more follow-up because we're not there all the time.
That's your time. But I can put you back on the list if you want. Mr. McNeely, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would say glad to hear your presentation and explanation on the working environment and working with the clients on repayment plans such as that, and working with your clientele. And I would encourage you to support the committee's housing as a human right. And if we hear from providers of accommodations like your company, that would give us more oversight and insight to allow us to enter that into our report to see where recommendations could be going from the report. If it means going to the city of Yellowknife to release more lands because we're overcrowded, there's a development crisis because of a housing crisis. I think we can all agree to that. We hear that in all our smaller communities as well. So it's not only common in Yellowknife, it's common all over. So having written statements from your company to engage in our report would really clarify that we covered a large population with the publication of our report on housing as a human right. Thank you.
Are you looking for something specific, Mr. McNeely?
No, it's just my right.
Okay. Go ahead.
No, Mr. Chair, it's just my closing comment to encourage you to make a submission on the challenges faced by your company in this environment as the meaningful intent of the committees undertaking this housing as a human right. So the more we hear from the public and private sector, the more stronger our report will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. And Ms. Bruce has provided the committee evidence that she does support housing as a human right, but I will let you speak to this as well. Maybe there's more detail you can provide the committee to help our report, Ms. Bruce.
I appreciate the comment, and yes, we do support it. I think the level of support would, I guess, depend on the framework and what comes out of it. There is a wariness that legislation would hamper private sector. And that's where, unfortunately, we don't support it. We feel it's more of a public sector solution that we would support.
Nothing further, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mealy. Can I just clarify when you said it's more of a public sector solution, you mean, can you just tease that out a bit, like housing as a human right? You see that as something that would infuse kind of GNWT policy around social housing, for example, and not impact markets, Ms. Bruce?
Yeah, I would see it more around social housing, public housing, government housing. The private apartment buildings are run exactly like private business. I think the metaphor I've liked to use is you don't see anyone approaching the grocery stores and saying, take this side of your produce shelf and it has to be sold for a lower amount to people on less income. It's not something considered because it is private sector. However, it does get considered when it comes to landlords.
Ms. Yakalaya?
Thank you. I think you mentioned income support. Is there anything, do you have arrangements with YWCA that seems to be working successfully and people are able to transition into paying their own rent and doing that? The income support, have you guys worked with them to kind of make some kind of an arrangement that's similar to how the YWCA arrangement that you have with them? And if not, then looking at that, is there a recommendation you have for us that we can work on to ensure that income support recipients pay the rent? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce?
No, we haven't been approached by anyone for something like that. When it comes to the YWCA, that is driven by them, and I give them the kudos for what they run there. We just work with them. I think part of that success boils down to they have a caseworker with that resident, and it's a bit more of a human touch versus a check being run and mailed to the landlord every month. So we have a point of contact when we have any behavioral issues or payment issues. We have a point of contact, and they work as a mediator between us and the resident. And I guess it's the human touch that makes it successful.
So you don't actually speak with anybody at income support, you just speak with a resident or a client that wants to rent?
Yeah, the client comes and rents off of us with a letter from income support that they will be covering the rent. And that's usually the extent of our communication.
Ms. Yakalaya?
Yeah, there has to be more in place where there's a safety for you as the owner of the building to ensure that you're going to get the rent. However, there's nothing to say that renters, well, they do sign a lease saying they have to pay the rent at this date or whatever. However, income support provides a check to clients, and sometimes they miss your office for whatever reason. But yeah, it's I'm not sure how to organize that except to say to go back to the income support and say we need some kind of an agreement in place so the rent actually gets sent to us and not somewhere else. I'm not sure how that will work out or how that, but if you had a suggestion, what would that be? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce?
The rent does get sent directly to us. It's just the paperwork behind the rent we're not involved in. So some income support clients are on, an example, long-term disability, and that's just an automatic check gets mailed to us every month. Others that are newer on the program actually have to reapply every month, and we do not see the results of that application because it is private. So we're not aware they've been approved again or not until we don't have a check.
Ms. Yakalaya.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's on to the onus of the client to make sure that they, and then you did say, was there, I think you mentioned that you worked with the client, especially the YWCA, if there's, you can sit and talk with them and say, well, what is going on with you? Why are you not paying your rent? What is happening? How can we help you? Is that something that you guys do with individual clients? Because sometimes, like you said, the human touch, people need to be understood, they need to be heard, and how do you do that with clients that are not paying their rent? Thank you.
Ms. Bruce.
There's actually some wonderful supports in place. Jordan's principle, I'm not sure what it's called now, the HAP funding. We put them in touch, and we'll even fill out applications with them to help them get funding to supplement their rent when they fall on harder times.
Ms. Yakalaya, anything? No. Mr. McNeely.
I was saving my last one here, Ms. Bruce. I'm really glad that, the private sector and the public sector is really jointly working with this government, and this government working with the other stakeholders to address this housing crisis throughout the whole territories. And if I keep using Delaney as an example, population 660 people. In recent years, the community self-government organization and the territorial government brought in 36 units, and they're still in the housing crisis. And they're moving ahead. Compliments to this government and the federal programs such as the Rapid Housing Program. My question, Ms. Bruce, is that number one, I'm glad to see your organization or your business contributing affordable housing to the community. What percentage of the clients in your 13 buildings are income support clients? Is it 40, 50, 60? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Bruce.
Apologies, I honestly don't know the percentage. I would say it's probably closer to 15 or 20%.
McNeely.
No, nothing further. Nothing further, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Great. Committee, anything further for our witness today? Well, seeing none, I'd like to thank you very much for being here, Ms. Bruce. Certainly, the committee's viewpoint is we need to find a way for all stakeholders to work together to solve this problem, and we haven't heard a lot from private. Well, we're starting to hear more from private sector, and it's encouraging because you deal with a very small market, and there's certainly challenges that it's helpful for committee to be aware of. So I'll allow you to provide any concluding comments. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for bringing me to the table to present, and I do appreciate that you are hearing from private sector. I don't think there's a simple solution or a quick solution to this, so I appreciate the work you're all putting in, and we're here to give feedback whenever, and kind of look forward to seeing how it moves forward.
Thank you, Ms. Bruce. Committee, that concludes the public, or sorry, members of the public, that concludes the public portion of this meeting. Thank you.
Thank you.